Hey, I'm Jim Dewey, and this is Combating the Narrative. So this video is going to be a bit of a departure from my previous content. Being frank, my time has been very limited of late, and I want to make sure that if I'm going to dedicate hours and hours and hours of my time to debunking a liberal historian, it's not some low-hanging fruit like Att and Shea. To that end, if you guys have any suggestions, I'd appreciate it. Liking the video, commenting, and subscribing also helps me get my message out there as well as feel like what I'm doing is worthwhile. Okay, with that out of the way, let's jump into it. Truth be known, initially after I made this video, I scrapped it. I felt that the response to it would be overwhelmingly negative because many would not see that I'm coming from a place of love and concern and care for my people and my country. They would accuse me of being a defeatist or attempting to demoralize them and say that I'm working against our common cause. But the two recent rulings from the Supreme Court regarding firearms ownership and abortion have led to calls for violence from both sides, mostly on the left, admittedly. So now I feel impelled to say my piece on the matter. Now, I recently made a Gab post about this subject, and it's been bouncing around in my head ever since. Now, I don't think it's a controversial statement at this point to say that the conservatives are on the losing end of the culture war. They've managed to conserve virtually nothing, and the country has radically been altered over the course of the last 70 years or so. Now, as I'm reflecting on why this phenomenon exists, it's occurred to me that in large part, ironically enough, it's due to the existence of the Second Amendment and the extraordinary arrogance and hubris it provides those who enjoy it. It's actually almost served as a pressure valve for the conservative side of the aisle. If one spends enough time around conservatives, especially conservatives at gun stores, you'll hear variations on the following theme. The current political shift against my people and my party is of little importance because if all else fails, I still have the Second Amendment, and I'll just start shooting. After all, the police and military are on my side anyway. And guerrillas almost always win. I mean, just look at Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam and even our own American Revolution. I mean, just think of all the guns we have in this country. Why, we'd probably drive them into Galveston Bay within a month. And this is always paired with some sort of red line in the sand that they have, too. If the government does X, I'm going to start shooting. And over time, when the government actually does that thing and they don't do anything about it, they grumble and then shift the line again. Well, I'm here to give my side of the aisle some tough love. I'm here to impress upon you the gravity and reality of our current situation and precisely what armed insurrection would mean for you and your family. My point isn't to be a defeatist or to demoralize people, but rather to encourage them to operate within the current political system, and rather than cowering and acquiescing and retreating and backing, to stop backpedaling and to take the initiative, to stand up politically for what they believe, to stop being afraid of being labeled a racist or a bigot or whatever the term du jour is for somebody who is double plus bad and engages in thought crime. Because no matter what you do, you're going to be labeled as such anyway. I promise you, you do not want the hell on earth a war in this country would be. I certainly don't want it. Yes, it's true. I'll grant you. Typically, guerrilla forces do end up winning against imperial forces. The operative term being imperial. Firstly, let's take a look at why that operative term, imperial, is so important. Typically, when imperial powers like Great Britain, the United States, or France are engaged in guerrilla conflicts, it's thousands of miles away. Guerrillas don't win by defeating these imperial powers on the field of battle. No, they win by draining them of resources until political power back home or some other more pressing world event forces them to withdraw. In this hypothetical Civil War Part 2 electric boogaloo that you guys fantasize about, you wouldn't be fighting some sort of far-flung imperial power. No, you would be an existential threat to the powers that be, who would fight tooth and nail and do whatever was required, however immoral, to ensure that you meet a swift defeat. You have to understand that you're less akin to the Viet Cong or the Mujahideen or the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, and more akin to groups like the Irish Republican Army. In case you weren't aware, the IRA was markedly less successful than the others I named. Secondly, consider how soft and decadent the comforts of Western society have made us. On the whole, Western man is fat and weak, not just physically, but morally, spiritually. You're not accustomed to the level of privation these third world, half-illiterate dirt farmers were used to on a daily basis in peacetime, let alone the horrors and difficulties of fighting a far superior power. These guerrillas that won these wars you like to name were used to discomfort and struggle as a part of their daily life. They were prepared to endure every pain and hardship, including death. Are you? Answer honestly. Most of you are unwilling to deprive your political adversaries of money by doing simple things like canceling your Amazon Prime subscription, or canceling your Netflix subscription, or not shopping at retailers that are openly against you, because you just can't get through your day without your shows, or your instant gratification, or your Starbucks. If you're unable to do these very simple things, how do you figure you're going to be able to wage a war? Thirdly, you have to consider the center of gravity and the critical vulnerability of any guerrilla force. Now, the center of gravity and critical vulnerability are key concepts within asymmetric war, maneuver war, Western military theory in general, since Karl von Clausewitz. For those of you who aren't familiar, I'll briefly explain it. In essence, the center of gravity is a source of power that provides moral or physical strength, freedom of action, or will to act. Or, in other terms, it's your source of strength. Now, the critical vulnerability is definitionally an aspect of a critical requirement which is deficient or vulnerable to direct or indirect attack that will create decisive or significant effects. So, essentially, it's just something that threatens your center of gravity. Or, more simply, your Achilles heel. So, during my schooling and training, when they talked about this, they gave us a pretty simple analogy, using chess. So, on a chessboard, what is your center of gravity? Well, it's what makes you strong. It's your primary source of physical strength and power. Your queen. She can move in any direction, any amount of spaces. She's your strongest piece, and most any other piece would do well to steer clear of the queen. Now, on a chessboard, what is your critical vulnerability? What undermines that strength? Well, it's the king. If we take the king out of action, it doesn't matter the amount of spaces or the direction that the queen can move, the game is over. Now, to expand on this concept a little further, let's do some simple battle calculus. The ability of a force to fight is the means to fight, so ammunition, money, fuel, so on and so forth, multiplied by the will to fight. And if either of those falls to zero, so too does your ability to fight. Now, bear all this in mind as we move forward. It's generally accepted that the center of gravity of any guerrilla force is the support of the people. Generally speaking, so too is the critical vulnerability. An insurgency is wholly dependent on the support of the people. The strength of an insurgency comes from its ability to blend in and out of the people, and to secure aid and comfort from the local populace. Now, the goal of a counterinsurgency force is to do something to either take away the support of the people, or to severely mitigate its effects. Now, due to the demographic shift, you and your ideals are in the minority, and you certainly can't count on any support from the people in any population center. Furthermore, consider the disparity between us, a first world nation, and nations like Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam. There exists an extensive surveillance infrastructure in this country. I can't even imagine what you would have to do to put yourself outside of some sort of surveillance system in this day and age. And virtually all people carry a cell phone on them, which is, in essence, a telescreen through which they can spy on you and track your movements. even if you had the support of the people, they very well may be able to root you out through use of technological espionage before you even start an insurgency, and without the support of the people. Now, as sort of a relevant aside, I was watching the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, and it surprised me that the FBI had the whole thing recorded on infrared from a drone. This was without having foreknowledge of the event. Sure, you could say they knew there was rioting going on, but what do you think the FBI would do if there was an open insurrection in this country? They would do everything within their power and probably ramp up their ability to surveil the nation. And it's not unreasonable to believe that in this day and age, the three-letter agencies have developed some sort of surveillance technology yet unknown to us in the general population that's far more effective. And this dovetails rather nicely into my fourth point, the casualty ratio. It's beyond dispute that even though certain guerrilla forces have won, they sustain losses almost an order of magnitude larger than their adversaries. There were many instances in Vietnam in which the casualty ratio was 100-1 in favor of the United States. Guerrilla forces don't win conventional pitched battles against first world, first-rate militaries. I, for one, grew up watching the use of technology against guerrilla forces. Readily available on the internet is endless hours of gun cam footage from Apache helicopters and other close air support aircraft just smoking insurgents before they were even aware there was an enemy in the area. And this carries over well into my fifth point. The disparity in the arms and equipment of any potential guerrilla force and the United States military. The National Firearms Act hamstrung the Second Amendment long before most of us were born. And Reagan's gun reforms in '86 certainly didn't help matters either. Sure, there are a great number of small arms like AR-15s in the country. An American insurgency would certainly be much better off than some sort of European insurgency or an insurgency in any other country in which they do not possess large quantities of small arms. But small arms are of limited use, being really only effective against soft targets and some sensitive infrastructure. You could certainly make a nuisance of yourself for any counterinsurgency force, but consider that you're worse equipped than other insurgencies in history like the ones in Vietnam, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. You lack equipment that makes a difference on the tactical, operational, and strategic level. Consider what you lack: squad automatic weapons, anti-tank weapons, man-pads, anti-personnel mines, anti-armor mines, any form of artillery piece, including mortars, any form of close air support, any sort of up-armored vehicle in any great number. And though not technically illegal, at least in most states and municipalities, you also lack in great number equipment like body armor, night vision goggles, and the like. And consider that you are now without any sort of industrial base. Sure, many of you have probably hoarded thousands of rounds of ammunition, but do you know how fast ammunition goes? The U.S. Army has conducted studies that have determined that over 250,000, I'm going to emphasize that again, 250,000 rounds of ammunition are expended per kill in Iraq. Per kill. Do you have enough ammunition? Do you have the means to produce more ammunition when you run out? The answer is of course not. So, cool, you have small arms, but you probably run out of ammunition within 6 months, a year. And that's to say nothing of other supply shortages that come along with any war, such as food. Well, many would counter what I have just said by saying certainly other world powers like Russia and China would leap at the chance to support an American insurrection. Well, let's leave the fact that they're not your political ally in terms of political alignment aside. Maybe they're just looking to destabilize the United States. We'll go with that. Number one, they're not going to risk conflict with the United States and expend a bunch of money giving you equipment without you proving yourself through some sort of Saratoga event. So that's your first hurdle to overcome right there. But suppose you've done that. Suppose, through your own military genius and the American military's incompetence, you've managed to defeat the United States, or at least bloody their nose sufficiently that China and Russia and any other power might want to get involved on your behalf. You have to understand that neither China nor Russia at this point in time is capable of standing toe-to-toe with the United States in some sort of expeditionary conflict. And if you don't think NATO and the United Nations would get involved on behalf of the United States government, you're a fool. Do you honestly believe that the Chinese or Russians can infiltrate NATO airspace to give you these supplies? Can they slip past a NATO naval blockade? Sure, some supplies would get through, probably through our southern border, which would almost certainly be locked down in the event of a crisis. But would it be enough? Probably not. Certainly not enough to sustain the conflict. Russia is not the Soviet Union of old. Their performance in Ukraine has proved that. And though China is an up-and-coming power, again, they do not possess the Blue Water Navy or large air force required to slip supplies into the United States. And this is the natural segue into my sixth point. There exists no nearby friendly power for you to utilize as a safe haven as an insurgent group. That was the primary method that the Soviet Union and North Vietnamese army used to get supplies into South Vietnam to sustain the fight. Furthermore, Al-Qaeda could retreat into Pakistan without the United States touching them. The Viet Cong could retreat into Cambodia, Laos, and North Vietnam. This almost certainly prevented the total annihilation of the conventional forces they possessed. And make no mistake, the successful insurgencies of history also possessed a conventional force. Guerrilla forces and disruption alone are not enough. You need a standing army to take, hold, and occupy territory. The Viet Cong had the North Vietnamese army. The United States had the Continental and the French armies. Where would you even begin to organize, let alone train or move a conventional army here in the United States? You would likely be hard-pressed to get 20 men together without becoming acquainted with the 2,000-pound JDAM. Who is going to give you safe haven? Canada? Mexico? Cuba? Doubtful. And there's no real great world power that the United States need be afraid of at this point in time. They can more or less do whatever they want short of a nuclear exchange with little to no repercussion, as we've done for nigh on 70 years at this point. And a war here in the United States would not be some Napoleonic war of old in which the rules of war are adhered to and quarter is given. No, you want to know what would happen to you and your family and anyone you care about? You'd be treated as partisans, as guerrillas, as rebels who would be afforded no protection. Even under the Geneva Convention and the Hague, this government would do whatever is necessary to protect its powers, so you know where you'd probably find yourself? Shoulder to shoulder with your family and your buddies in front of an open pit, waiting to get a bullet put in the back of your head. And I mean, if you think I'm exaggerating, just look at the treatment of the oh-so-violent insurrectionists from January 6th. If the powers that be are willing to treat those people in the way that they have been treated thus far, what do you think they're willing to do to you? And just speaking from both anecdotal experience and polls conducted like this one from 2020 in the Military Times, the military is not on your side. You can thank the corruption of institutions like West Point and the demographic shift and the cleaning house of high-ranking conservative officers over the past decade or so. As of 2020, only 38% of the rank and file supported a Republican candidate. Though I can't find any specific data on officers, again, from personal experience, I would hazard a guess that the number is far lower. And it's probably even lower on the whole now that those who have refused to get the jab are getting discharged. Now, YouTube, I am not commenting on whether or not one should get the vaccine. I'm just saying that more conservative-leaning people have refused to get the vaccine. And for those of you who are interested to know the goings-on at the institutions producing officers for the future and their political leanings, I'll link a couple of letters and articles in the description. Suffice to say, the Corps truly has gone to hell in a handbasket. Now, this list in this video is obviously not meant to be all-inclusive of all the problems an insurgency would face here in the United States, nor am I commenting on whether or not it would be successful. Indeed, in the end, after some 40 or 50 years, they would probably see some sort of limited success at great cost, if I had to make a guess. My point is to impress how difficult and costly and terrible such a conflict would be. I promise you 3%er and Oathkeeper types, you don't want none of the smoke. Even if you served in Iraq and Afghanistan, that is not the type of war you would experience. Look at how quickly the foreign legionnaires, comprised mostly of Western military veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, got clapped in Ukraine. IDF and close air support really is a bitch, huh? It's hard to fight when you don't have air superiority. The overwhelming majority of anyone who would take up arms would likely die. Again, to summarize, my point here isn't to blackpill or demoralize those on my side of the aisle. It's to get you to stand up and advocate for our movement in a peaceful yet forceful way. Stop being cowards, confront white hate, confront moral decadence, raise your children right, live in a traditional way, grow food, educate your own children, live a good, strong, moral life. Live within your means and do your best to be a virtuous person. Living a good life is the best way you can combat this stuff immediately. This movement and our people and our culture can only succeed if we do this. And the best way we can affect some sort of political change we want to see in the here and now, the immediate future, is by using the existing political infrastructure and the existing political system to the best of our abilities. Now, what do I mean by this? Do I mean that you should just trust the plan and continue to vote for Republicans across the board? No, I think you're a damned fool if you think that that's going to affect any change. It hasn't for quite some time. And as time goes on, the radicalization of the left and the demographic shift in this country is only going to make any sort of meaningful political change less and less and less likely. However, at this point in time, there still is some hope. We still retain some sort of institutional power, especially in terms of state and local governments. So instead of waiting for the left to kick off some sort of civil war in this country, which they'd never do anyway, time is on their side, wars are expensive and costly, and you've already proven you'll never do anything. Why don't you start trying to utilize the current political control we have in certain states to advocate for a peaceful national divorce? The Alternative Hypothesis has a pretty good video on this subject, which I'll link if I can find it. However, he's got an annoying habit of deleting his content. The only thing stopping this idea from becoming reality is us and our side of the aisle. There are millions of people out there who feel the exact same way you and I do. All we need to do is band together. Stop being cowards. Voice your support for things you believe in. Stop trusting that Republicans have your best interests in mind any more than the Democrats do. I promise you, the alternative is far worse and far more difficult. Yes, the Second Amendment is important and we need to be fighting to expand gun rights in this country, or rather take back what was taken from us. But don't treat your firearm as a security blanket. The Second Amendment is a last-ditch thing when all else has failed, and all else has not failed, not yet. And to those of you who believe all has failed and there is no political solution, and hey, maybe you're right, it's pretty polarized in this country right now. There have been mainstream political pundits talking about the possibility of a national divorce. Maybe that is the way to go. But again, you only get there through political means. And even if you feel that it will inevitably come to violence, you need some sort of political power in this country in order to do so. Just from a pragmatic standpoint, you would need the support of whole states and whatever military infrastructure and materiel they can conjure up. You can only do that if you have some semblance of political power large enough to do it. And you don't gain that political power by backing and retreating and accommodating and living in fear and muttering or thinking to yourself that eventually you'll just have to use your gun, because we both know you won't anyway. And now I'm going to speak directly to those on the left who are diametrically opposed to us. Don't for a moment think that you wouldn't suffer greatly too. Any guerrilla force is not going to try and stand toe-to-toe with a conventional army. It's not going to happen. At least, not intentionally and not very often. Do you know what guerrillas and insurgents do? They hit soft targets, critical infrastructure like foundries, ports, rail yards, shipyards, airports, food and water sources, electrical grids. They go after women and children and the civilian population in general. I know you Marxist and progressive movements have enjoyed thus far the protection of the institution. If you keep pushing for that revolution and race war that you guys want, be careful because you just might get it. Just like those on my side of the aisle, you don't quite understand what violence means. So, speaking as somebody who abhors and condemns all forms of violence, especially political violence, it is in everyone's best interest, yours and mine, to consider a peaceful separation at this point. Don't agitate for violence because I promise you, you don't want the smoke either. But I know all this is going to fall on deaf ears anyway.